Well, what's up, motherfuckers? It's your old pal King Washmaker here with another exciting episode of Thunderdome tonight. I guess I just want to start off with this kind of with a general. I don't want to give the impression that I'm nothing but doom and gloom about everything going on right now. There are positive futures that can be found. It's just from thinking through all the various permutations of everything that could evolve out of what's currently happening. Plus, there's still unknowns to occur before we achieve any sort of sense of normality again. There's more negative paths forward than there are positive paths forward. And I do think it's appropriate to be trying to sound the alarm on these things, because I don't think it's healthy for us to continue to just kind of stay in a denial state, acting like everything's going to go back to normal when that's clearly not the case. But at the same time, to say that bad things are on the horizon isn't to say I want that to be the case or that I want these things to happen. The idea of sounding an alarm on something is to hopefully get people to maybe take a moment and pause and consider what they're doing a little bit more carefully so that they can get onto a better path. Because at times, like when going back through some of my own videos since I've been doing this live stream stuff at night, I don't want to just sound like I'm just constantly thinking that all reality is going to come undone or anything like that. And also, I don't want to come across as being too negative on the forces pushing for change. I mean, as I said, the whole idea of why I've been calling this an apocalypse and accurately calling this an apocalypse since COVID started is because the actual definition of apocalypse is the great change, and we are undergoing a great change. It's just not necessarily the one would have predicted specifically, but early on, it's hard to say what the inciting incidents could end up being and what those would lead to, because all that kind of stuff is a little too nebulous to project. You can just see general trend lines, and you can just see the general pressures that are being built up in society. And just by looking back through history, you can see all the different ways those can be vented out and that pressure can be released. And this is just happens to be the form that ours has taken. But also at the same time, I do feel a little appropriate and being justified in trying to be a little alarmist in my own way about everything that's going on. Because in other ways, though, like all of this has happened a lot faster and more abruptly and more violently than I expected it to go. I was expecting some sort of like vague idea of food riots or homelessness riots or job riots or something, or some sort of like large, massive strikes taking place later on in the summer. But, the idea that America's constant focus on race incidents involving the police being the thing that caused the conflagration that we're now all having to learn to live with, I guess that could have been foreseen, obviously. So, but it could have been a couple other things. It just happens to be where we are. I do think, though, it's also good to remind is such that, our information that we get makes the world seem worse than it is at times. Cameras are always going to be pointed at whatever is going on. The cameras are not going to be pointed at what's not going on. If there's a bunch of fighting and rioting and looting, the cameras are going to be there and they're going to be pointed at that. If there's a bunch of racist cops, the cameras are going to be there or they're going to be pointed at. Those cameras are not going to be pointed at an empty cow field out in the middle of nowhere at the exact same time that these other things are going on. They're not going to portray to you the vast reality of what all is happening at the same time on Earth. And as much as our news media filter gives us the impression that we're living in the most horrible age of all kind, the statistics still bear out that in spite of everything that's going on right now, all across the planet, with all the atrocities and horror that is being wrought as we speak, this is still the safest, most peaceful and chill time in all of human history. And I don't want us to retrograde on that out of some misguided sense of moral superiority to the past. There's an unfortunate truth. There's a lot of unfortunate truth, but there's the one I'm going to speak about. There's an unfortunate truth about America's race relations issues as to both why it's never been able to be resolved and why it's never going to be able to be resolved. As long as we are focused more on the past and what we owe to the past than we are focused on what we owe to the future, we could go for like 5,000 years and still be like stuck in a cycle of recrimination over America's history of slavery. The past happened. There's no way to undo the past. It's always going to be there. So as long as you're pointed backwards looking at it, it's always going to be on your mind and it'll never be resolved, ever. So I would just personally think, just for our own like general state of mental health, we need to start shifting ourselves as overall, all of us, into more of a future forward way of looking, because for all the horror and all the shame that comes with that horror of what was done to build the world that we live in, our ancestors did either do or suffer a lot of terrible shit to make sure we had a chill planet to live on, one relatively free of predation from animals, and with plenty of food and ability to travel around everywhere, and a relative state of peace and harmony and luxury that was undreamed of for the vast majority of human existence. Back when we were in the long, endless night twilight of the Stone Age, sort of a thing. I think our modern culture is like too detached from the reality of life in many ways. We live too coddled, we're too pampered, so that we kind of forget the reality of what things used to be like. We have a television dramatized version in our minds of what life on Earth was like, as opposed to the reality of things. We also have a real curated and filtered way of looking at history, especially in how the oral history is presented as opposed to the written history. The oral history is always going to be a bit dumbed down because it's being transmitted orally. It's just what people, the general common knowledge that's understood without proper schooling and access to books and all that kind of stuff. But what regular average, what you used to call peasants once upon a time, what they think about themselves and their history, that's the oral history. And the oral history is always going to be more simplified, obviously. And that's, I think, part of our problem is our oral histories. It's all so reductive, and people don't like it when I make reductive arguments, but yet we live in a planet that's like nothing but a bunch of reductive statements about things. And, it's not that by being reductive, it's being untrue, but it's leaving out so much of the greater palette in order to be able to establish a comfortable narrative. There are serious things going on. I don't know if it's just that people are getting more numb to it, or I'm just not noticing as much news about it, but like, I want to say it feels like the rioting and protests are getting quieter, but I don't know if that's true or not. I guess I could get back on Twitter and see what it has to say. Probably not, though. I still say if we really want to fix this country, and we do have opportunity to do that right now, I don't trust human nature. Human nature. there are certain patterns that can be triggered in us, especially when you're dealing with like large group mob kind of dynamics. And that, our social media, internet has really brought mob dynamics back into human society in a big way, in a big way. And that's dangerous because it's already given us this lightweight, not quite literally burning people alive inquisition, but man, they could slide there. It could slide there pretty easy. I guess it comes down to like the experiment in Minneapolis and with any other cities that join in on this whole like dismantle the police force thing. Kind of comes down to how well can we really trust the conditioning that our last few generations have had from how we've been raised, to learning how to read from Muppets and stuff on Sesame Street and all the kind of cartoon messaging and all the child psychology bullshit that was written into all those shows that we were all raised on as children in this country for about 40 to 50 years now. How well is that conditioning that to make us passive, peaceful creatures that are cautious about fighting and care about, the feelings of others and all that kind of stuff, and not just be selfish little creatures? How well is that conditioning gonna hold together so that, any of these cities that do participate in this particularly brand new experiment don't end up devolving into the chaotic free-for-all that the more worst case scenario implies? And I think it's already kind of evidence from how we are right now that we're not conditioned enough to be trustworthy. So it'd be great if it does work. I don't see how it's going to. But I'll gladly eat crow if somehow that city manages to get through this and not be completely abandoned and end up just another Detroit, basically, possibly worse. Like, there are things that we do need to do to fix certain aspects of our society. Demilitarizing our police is just part of a larger puzzle. If we really want to get rid of the corruption, there's like two things we need to do. We need to abolish political parties and just allow people to just run for offices on their own. Because we have social media, it'd be a hell of a lot easier for people to do that without having to have a party apparatus. And all the political parties seem to do is they act as corporations that sell direct access to politicians to major donators. So either corporations or, wealthy people. The fact that they're able to get small time donations from voters is just icing on the cake. It doesn't really give those voters any true influence. You can just do away with the whole thing. Just let people run on their own merits. Our country was not supposed to have parties. I know I've heard stuff about George Washington being against parties and all that kind of shit. So, get rid of that. And if we could somehow nullify Wall Street, there's got to be a different way to be able to run investment for businesses that need investors without turning it into this weird gambling establishment. I mean, the thing that's eating our economy alive right now, the thing that's just the real threat to our economy with the COVID shutdown is caused by the stock market and its constant need for publicly traded companies to have continuous growth every 4 months so that they can, give out their returns to their investors and all that kind of shit. It's a Ponzi scheme. And it creates that endless growth cycle that mutates capitalism. Basic capitalism is fine. It's not a thing that anyone really came up with. It evolved on its own. The basic cycle of supply and demand. We have gone so far beyond that, though, by this point. I don't even really think it's right to even use the word capitalism because it's kind of describing two different things. It's like Bruce Banner or the Incredible Hulk. we've taken things to a level of just esoteric nonsense where people are just allowed to use like a bunch of mathematic trickery to just invent wealth for themselves. It makes us all look like we're doing well. It's at a terrible expense, and we'd be weathering this whole shutdown a hell of a lot better if businesses were just allowed to make enough money to pay off their bills and their employees and squeak out a little bit of profit and coast through, instead of like, well, you only had 1% growth and we were expecting at least 2.5% based on our projections to our stockholders. So I guess your company's going to have to be liquidated. That's the kind of shit that's fucking us up. So get rid of the stock market and get rid of the political parties that allow lobbyists to have the kind of access they have to politicians, where like not even just like access to be able to bribe them and crap, or they're literally like writing them their legislation. I remember something where like some lobbyist firms, their justification for wanting money for the bailout for shutdown companies was because lobbyists are essential, because who's going to write legislation for the Congress if they don't have lobbyists to do it for them? And like, wow, that speaks volumes. That's not what we're supposed to be electing people to do. We're supposed to be electing people so that they write the fucking legislation. If they're not capable of writing the legislation, then why are we electing them? We're electing the wrong people for the wrong kinds of positions. It's an unfortunate side effect of television, maybe, but like, we elect suspiciously pretty looking people a lot. That's all I'll say. The charisma and good looks of your politician should not be at all near the top of your list as to why you want them in office. You want them because they have good ideas and know what the fuck they're doing, that they understand the job they're taking, that they're actually qualified to be a legislator. And if they're having to have lobbyists, hand them special Walmart approved legislation, that's why, with all the stuff going on with Black Lives Matter and the defund the police, any legislation the Democrats try to push through right now that's supposed to be in favor of these movements, I would pick through that legislation with a fine tooth comb if I were you, because there's going to be all sorts of fucking shit hidden in that. The Democrats and the Republicans both spent the last 20 years sinking a ton of money and resources into this country's security apparatus. Right now, in the initial phase of panic and wanting to try to capitalize on all this movement in some sort of political fashion, their willingness to make motions as if they care is a temporary thing. As they consider their path forward, especially since we have months to go until there's an election, and that we could have a potential change in the power dynamics of Washington and various state legislatures. They're going to have time to think real carefully about exactly what they all want to sneak into whatever this legislation is. And they might title this bill, Black people are amazing, fuck the cops, Amendment 7. They could have the most stunningly perfect name for you. It could be, we're going to suck your cock, the amendment. This is the free blowjobs bill of 2021. Wow, that sounds amazing. But it's 2,000 pages long. And whereas the first couple paragraphs sound like it has to do with getting amazing blowjobs from the government, the next 2,000 pages are all the ways they're going to fuck you in the fucking ass afterwards. And not do it all. It end up getting out of actually having to give you a blowjob by the time you get to the end of that fucking shit. This isn't gonna. The idea that they're gonna just get rid of the cops, man, I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical that they're really gonna pull the trigger on it. And when they don't, yeah, that's why, there's a few paths out of this where things work and everything can be kumbaya, but it's hard seeing it. It's hard seeing how that's going to be realistic at all. So yeah, I guess that's my attempt at having a positive rant about America's current events. On top of all this, we're still also marching towards World War III. even if we avoid the Civil War, any countries out there that have any interest in expanding their territory, like, this is your moment, guys. Like, America is as distracted as we're going to get. If you're going to try to make a move and get away with it, do it now while our back's turned and we're looking at our own fucking problems. You're not going to get like these kinds of mini windows unless you're just hoping that we do manage to fucking burn our whole goddamn thing out. Like, what's next after the police? Are we going to like then defund the military all the way? Or are we going to leave enough to make sure that like countries aren't going to like, well, America's defenseless now, I guess we can go take it over, because it's what you do to countries that don't have any defenses. We might all be fucking speaking Canadian by the end of next year, man. You got to be careful. All those bloodthirsty beaver pelt wearing moose fuckers. There's no clear answer to any of it. And I think that ties into part of what I was saying of like, because this is rooted in past events, this particular manifestation of how America decided to like have a big radical change in the midst of all this. There's no resolution to it. And it's not fair. If you're going to be fair to everyone or you're going to be fair to no one. I'm kind of like a either or. I don't believe in just being fair to some people and other people like fuck them. Regardless of the past, like, it is unfair to the modern living generation of white people to be browbeating this much and holding us responsible for shit that we had absolutely no say in whatsoever. Absolutely no say in whatsoever. And nothing we can possibly do to like undo any of it. There is no time machine. Hell, even to go back in time and stop it all from happening would erase all of us from existence. Not like all white people, but like almost everyone on the planet for a large part, because of how much of an effect it would have had on human migration over the last 600 years. We were to like entirely stop the conquest of America, all that kind of shit. You can go back in time, like any change over the last several centuries could have drastic effects on the exact genetic combinations that lead us to the specific human beings that we have right now. We'd have a completely different world full of completely different people if we change a thing. So we couldn't even do it if we could, because we would just be erasing everything. And there's no guarantees that the alternate timeline would have been any better at all. The alternate timeline could have led to damn extinction. I guess in the end, that's why I've always been on just the idea of just the subconscious experiment that America is doing, is that we're just breeding all of humanity's ethnic groups together into one like uber race that's descended from the entire planet all at once, maybe in different degrees. No sandwich is 50% of everything. It's got different amounts of different things. But the faster we can just breed everyone together, the harder it will be for us to continue to like bitch about each other for being white or black or whatever, if we're all the same kind of soupy gray. But at the same time, that erases a lot of different culture. They'll survive in bits and pieces in a new jumbled whole. And it's not just like it erases white culture, it also erases black culture. The idea that white genocide by breeding us out, by interbreeding with other races. Well, that's also genocide on those races too. White genocide through interbreeding with black people is also black genocide through interbreeding with white people. But it seems more humane than genocide the other way. This is seriously like the last 70 years since the end of the world wars. This has like been the most peaceful this planet has ever been. Maybe not in scale because there are more people, but like how savage it used to be and how savage it could quickly become again. People like are not really quite cognizant yet of how much we can get away with now because the cops are so stood down, as they are even right now. And that's just going to get worse as people become more aware of it. You don't think that this country is not going to see a fucking massive spike in murder rates and all other sorts of fucking shit? all those sorts of crimes. Good God, you just had a bunch of people protesting in the streets, holding signs up about silence is consent. Like, well, like that's gonna go over well with the rape crowd, especially as law goes away. You know, in a policeless society, like how are all these neighborhood watches going to arbitrate incidents between each other? You can't like just have a small scale. The whole reason, like one of the reasons why we even have kingdoms and governments in the first place, like one of the founding fundamental basic reasons, the reason why is to arbitrate so that there's an authority that can arbitrate disputes between opposing people, so it doesn't evolve into like massive clan fairs and shit. And we're just tossing all that out the window. We're going like far backward. Because also, like the modern generation is not cognizant of why things evolved the way they've evolved to be. That government evolved, that the way we do things evolved. You know, all the people who want to get rid of weapons and stuff, it's like are so blind to these centuries upon centuries of struggle it took for the peasant class to be allowed to have weapons without getting in trouble from the nobles and the warriors. It used to only like basically only rich people and people working for rich people were allowed to have weapons. And everyone else, you weren't allowed to have fucking shit. The fact that we're allowed to have guns or knives or anything is it took centuries for us to be able to fucking win that right as a peasantry people. But we forgot that we're still peasants. We all think of ourselves as potential billionaires instead. I find myself terribly in the middle about this whole situation. There's things to both sides that I agree with and I disagree with. In the end of flipping a coin, in most instances, I tend to prefer that when people can be left alone to their own devices and not being interfered with, that's generally the preferable path. People should be allowed to do their own thing and be left alone. But I don't think we're trustworthy for a pure, noble, utopian anarchy. And I don't trust communism because if you try to pull money out of the system, that turns everyone into slaves. And you still end up having to find something to fill the void for being able to keep track of how much people are owed that's fair to their labor output. And no matter what you call that thing, it still will end up functioning like money. So you might as well just keep money around. And trying to manage an entire country's economy item by item is a Herculean task. And adding racial dynamics to it isn't good. But thankfully, these are largely white people protesting, which is also like why isn't this cultural appropriation? Again, I mean, it's a bunch of white people out protesting because of a black guy getting killed. A bunch of white people chanting Black Lives Matter and shit. Like, I don't know how to tell you this, guys, but it's not going to get you turned into black people for doing all this. I can't help but have the thing that, you know, the people who are showing the most white guilt and doing the most prostrating for their guilt, well, isn't that what the people with the guilty conscience would be doing? If you have no reason to feel guilty, then you wouldn't be kneeling and washing people's feet and making your company posture and all that kind of shit. I mean, I said it before with all the brands that were doing all their online Black Lives Matter shit. You know, it's just because they have a guilty conscience because of all the terrible things that they do to exploit people and animals to test and develop and produce their products anyway. It's a way to get some free publicity. It's cynical. It's not genuine. And as much as people want to like think they're doing something just, it's the whole thing is cynical, and the longer it drags on, the more cynical and manipulative it's going to become. It's not like it was a specifically engineered event, but man, everything was perfectly set up in advance for just this kind of incident to come along just at the time and do what it's done. So, hopefully we get through it without forcing us all into positions that we don't want to be in. And I guess on that note, stay waspinated.